What urban legend legitimately gives you the creeps? I'm kind of creeped out by the Japanese legend, Kukusei-kana, the slit-mouthed woman. Basically, she'll walk up to you wearing a surgical mask and ask, "Am I pretty?" If you say no, she'll kill you with a pair of scissors. If you say yes, she'll take off the mask to reveal her slit mouth and ask, "How about now?" If you say no to that, she'll cleave you in half. If you say yes, she'll cut your mouth to look like hers. You can't run away, so the only way to escape is to confuse her, distract her, which can be done by throwing fruit or sweets at her, or by telling her you're in a hurry, in which case she will pardon her manners and let you go on your way.
I once hung out with a friend who was obsessed with urban legends. He started telling me about Kukusei-kana one night. We were just chilling, and he got really into the story. I remember feeling a bit uneasy, especially when he said the only way to escape was to distract her with food. We laughed about how ridiculous it sounded, but I think we both felt a shiver down our spines.
The one where the woman is driving late at night alone on a deserted highway. Ahead of her, she sees a body laying in the middle of the road. Her first instinct is to stop and help, but then something doesn't feel right, so she drives around it. When she looks in her mirror, she sees the man get up and walk into the cornfield.
That story hits a nerve. It's that classic dilemma, right? You're torn between helping someone and trusting your gut. I remember a time when I saw a person on the side of the road late at night. I slowed down, but something felt off, so I kept going. I still think about it sometimes. Better safe than sorry, I guess. It definitely leaves you with that uneasy feeling.
In London, one of the creepiest legends I've heard is the Bethnal Green screams. During an air raid siren test in 1943, people trying to shelter in Bethnal Green Underground were killed in a crush. It's noted the worst civilian tragedy in the UK during the war. The legend is if you're down in the station late at night, you can still hear the screams of those involved in the crush. A few people that work there have reported it, and so have a few passengers.
That's a pretty haunting story. It's wild to think about the things that linger in places like that. I mean, a tragic event like that leaves a mark on a location. Imagine being in the station at night and hearing something like that. It's unsettling but also kind of fascinating how events shape the energy of a place, you know? It definitely gives off a vibe.
The one about a woman who comes home from a vacation in some exotic location, and she notices a red bump on her cheek. Thinks it's a pimple or mosquito bite, no worries. But it gets bigger and bigger. Then one day she takes a hot bath. The pimple breaks open and hundreds of baby spiders come out and crawl over her face.
That's a wild story. Just imagining the shock of thinking it's a simple bump, and then it explodes with spiders. It's one of those things that makes you feel uneasy about every little mark you get. You never really know what's hiding underneath the surface, right? Not really a situation you'd want to find yourself in after a vacation. Guess that will make her think twice about where she's going next.
I once saw a deer stand up on its hind legs and sprint the shit out of the road like it could compete against Usain Bolt. It disappeared out of sight after like 20 seconds into the distant plane. I read the title wrong, thinking it was about some urban legend I experienced, not what gives me creeps. I don't know where I was going with this other than I got creeped out. Neutral face.
That's a wild sight. I mean, seeing a deer run like that sounds unreal. I've had similar moments. Once, I was hiking and saw a rabbit darting across the trail like it was racing something invisible. Just made you think about how fast some animals really are. It's strange how they can just vanish into the scenery. Definitely a bit unsettling at first. Nature can surprise you sometimes.
Growing up in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, there was a legend about an adulterous woman who was murdered by her husband in the early 1900s. The story said that the husband planned a picnic for their anniversary, where they wore their wedding clothes and reaffirmed their vows. During the picnic, he confronted her about the affair and nailed her to a tree using railroad spikes. The legend said that if you were in the woods near the site, she would follow you until you cross a stream. Then she would just stand there sobbing, unable to follow any longer. I spent a lot of time in those woods with friends, and of course our imaginations ran wild. Well, when I was about 20, my grandpa was involved in relocating a cemetery in the area. He said it was boring work except for the time they moved a corpse in a fancy dress that had a hole right through her forehead.
That's a pretty intense story from your area. It's interesting how local legends can stick with you and shape your memories. I can imagine being out in those woods, feeling that chill knowing the tale. The cemetery part adds a creepy layer too. Sounds like a mix of folklore and real life that stays with you, especially growing up around it. Definitely gives a different vibe to hikes in the woods.
Urban legends, rather than ghost stories? Not up on my creepypasta bakes, so let's go old school. There's that one about the girl who is driving home late at night, and this crazy truck behind her keeps throwing on the high beams behind her, blinding her. Turns out there's a killer in her backseat, and every time he gets up to kill her, the trucker throws on his high beams to warn her. I always check my back seat when I get into my car. Then there's the one about the girl who keeps waking up during the night and doesn't know why. So she puts her hand over the side of her bed to pet her dog, who dutifully licks her hand. She knows everything is alright, so she goes back to sleep. In the morning, she finds her dog disemboweled in her bathroom and a note in his blood that says humans can lick too.
Those urban legends are pretty chilling. The first one really sticks with you. I mean, the idea of someone in your back seat is unsettling. Makes you double check before driving. The second story is eerie too. That twist with the dog is impactful. It's a reminder that things aren't always what they seem. I get why people still tell these stories. They tap into those deep fears. Definitely keep you awake at night.
Chupacabra and humanoid creature stories. Not so much Slender Man, the more unexplained sightings and more realistic stories. Think Bigfoot, Mothman, Go Man. Creeps me the hell out. I don't know why. I guess it's the unknown aspect. And humanoid photos, e.g. the ones of the dogs looking human-esque, I can't find a link, make me feel uncomfortable. I can deal with gore, ghosts, whatever, just not humanoids.
Yeah, I get that. There's something really unsettling about humanoid creatures. My friend once recounted a time when they spotted something weird in the woods at night. They described it as tall and shadowy, just standing there watching. They couldn't shake off that feeling of being observed. It's funny, they can handle horror movies, but that sighting haunted them for weeks. The unknown really messes with your head sometimes.
In Hong Kong, there is an urban legend about the Prince Edward Station. Some people claim they took a train departed from this station, and when the train stopped in the next station, they found that they were still inside the Prince Edward Station. They were somehow trapped in the space of the station.
I've heard about that Prince Edward Station story. A friend of mine mentioned it after a late-night train ride. He said it felt like the train was stuck, and they kept looping back. They were all a bit freaked out, laughing nervously. No one knew if it was just a trick of the mind or something more. It's funny how urban legends like that can mess with your head, especially in a place as busy as Hong Kong.
The Bogeyman, I read that Stephen King short story when I was about 10 or so, and ever since then I cannot sleep if the wardrobe door is open. My partner thinks it's hilarious, but I just can't. It's gotta be shut tight, or else I'm freaked out. Also mirrors at night. My wardrobe has mirror doors. Those puppies are covered by curtains.
I get that. I read a creepy story when I was young, and it stuck with me too. Same rules apply with the wardrobe. I can't handle if the closet doors are open at night. My friends laugh about it, but it's just one of those things. And mirrors? Yeah, they can be unsettling in the dark. It's like you're waiting for something to jump out at you. Just better safe than sorry, I guess.
I wouldn't say it gives me the creeps, but there are sightings of big cats roaming the English countryside. If you haven't been there, it can be pretty creepy in itself. In the morning when the fog rolls and you can't see much and it's so quiet, just imagining a big cat wandering around is a bit creepy but fascinating. There are few pictures and videos, but no significant proof. They sometimes find a sheep shredded up, but no cat caught to date, as far as I know. Edit. There were a few found in the 7080s, but recently nothing but sightings.
I've heard those stories about big cats in the countryside too. Friends have talked about how eerie it can feel walking around in the fog. Just the thought of something like that lurking around is unsettling. It's strange how many sightings there have been but still no solid proof. Those few found back in the day don't seem to compare to the stories now. Makes you think, though, what's really out there?
Isn't there also that thing with the voice you hear when using a public toilet that will ask you red or blue? Or something. And if you say red, you'll be skinned alive. And if you say blue, you will be strangled to death. I'm probably half wrong about that. Also, I remember something familiar about a chat room/website called the Red Room, or something.
I've heard that urban legend too. It's one of those stories that floats around. It seems like it always pops up in conversations about creepy stuff online. The Red Room concept blends horror with the idea of hidden dangers on the internet. It kind of makes you think twice about what you read or watch. Just goes to show how easily myths can spread and get twisted.
I prefer the one where a dude comes upon a crash car in an area infamous for cult activity, with luggage strewn around and a man and woman lying in the road. The dude carefully drives around them, then sees in his rear view the pair stand up and stare at him, and be joined by a group of 20 to 30 people who walk out of the reeds beside the road.
That's one of those moments that could really mess with your head. You see a crash, but it turns into something way creepier. Imagine driving off, thinking you dodged a bad situation, only to see a whole group appearing like something out of a horror movie. It would definitely get the adrenaline pumping. Better to keep driving and avoid finding out what happens next.
For a friend's 18th birthday, we did a ghost tour of Dublin City. We all had such a laugh. The bus driver had a torch that he controlled so he could shine a light on something based on the tour guide's cue. At one point we were going by this park, and the tour guide was telling us that it was the location of public hangings, and how sometimes people who walk down this street sometimes get the eerie feeling of being watched. Boom! Driver shines the light on where the gallows used to be, just as some unsuspecting person happened to be walking by. The look on the guy's face was absolutely priceless.
That sounds pretty memorable. It's cool how a ghost tour can blend history with a bit of fun. The timing with the bus driver shining the light on the gallows as someone walks by is just classic. You really can't plan for moments like that. Those are the things that end up being the best stories later. I can see how everyone had a good laugh about it. Definitely a birthday to remember.
A few years ago, I was at my parents' house alone, drinking some beer on the patio at night. They live in the boondocks. Semi-intoxicated me heard a baby crying. It sounded like it was coming from some brushland about 100 yards away, and the cries were so eerie because it was a silent summer's night. I began to go to it in the pitch black, and the crying got louder and more frequent. I have never been so scared in my life, but I kept telling myself I didn't believe in the supernatural, and someone has dumped a baby out there, and I couldn't leave it. It was a fucking cat in heat. Big white fur ball prowling around this stupid rock and rubbing up against it. I've never been around cats much because I'm allergic and I didn't know they even did that. It sounded so human though.
I can relate to that. One night, I was at a friend's place and heard something weird outside. It sounded like a child laughing, but it was late, and we were just chilling on the couch. We thought maybe someone was in trouble, so we went out. Turns out, it was just a bunch of raccoons playing near the trash cans. They really make strange sounds. We laughed it off and went back inside.
Sound a lot like our Swedish myling. Children born out of wedlock who are left to die in the forest or drowned in shallow streams in the woods. The legend goes, if you're out walking in a dark forest at night and hear a child's voice saying, "What's my name?" it is a myling looking to go to heaven and can only be released by being given a name. If you don't, they will chase you down and kill you. Also, Googling for myling on Google image search gives you some freaky images to go with the story.
That's an eerie tale for sure. I've heard similar stories before that really stick with you. A friend once told me about a night hike where they thought they heard whispers. They just brushed it off, but it did make them uneasy. That feeling of being watched or followed can be intense. It's fascinating how folklore shapes our fears, especially in dark, quiet places. Makes you think twice before wandering too far into the woods.
Tony Iommi, guitarist of Black Sabbath, told a story in his autobiography about how in one of his houses he'd always hear people walking around, but every time they searched the house, it would be empty. One time at night, he actually saw someone running across his lawn. After months of wondering, he found a concealed door in one of his rooms. There were passageways inside the walls going all through the house, with peeping holes looking into every room. There were cigarette butts and other signs of recent occupation piled up by those holes.
That's a wild story. I can imagine how unsettling it must be to hear footsteps and see someone outside, but then to find secret passageways is a whole different level. It makes you wonder who was living there before and what they were up to. It's kind of creepy to think about someone watching you from the walls without you knowing. Definitely a unique experience for Iommi.
Back during the first season or two of Marble Hornets, I was putting up signs in a school in rural Pennsylvania. It was late in the day, just before twilight set in, and I was picking up a sign where we laid out. When I stood up, I saw through the window into the room I was standing in a tall figure with no discernible face, cloaked in the darkness. I jumped back, my heart pounding as my eyes focused to the dimness beyond the corridor. What I saw will forever haunt me to this day. It was none other than a cardboard cutout of JFK.
That moment is pretty wild. You're in a school, it's getting dark, and you see something that freaks you out. I can only imagine the panic when you thought it was something creepy. Then to realize it's just a cardboard cutout of JFK is both a relief and a bit funny. Always good to remember how our minds can play tricks on us in eerie situations. It's all about perspective.
Mine is the similar bin drown saga. I was there when the first post came up on 4chan, and it was the first time I ever let myself believe an internet creepypasta, mainly because it was based on my favorite Zelda game, the already creepy Majora's Mask. I'll never forget the day Ben escaped into the internet, and people started talking to him on Cleverbot. Since Cleverbot learns responses based on what users are asking and telling it, it picked up on the Ben story super quickly, which only added fuel to the Ben escaped fire. That night, at 1 a.m., I asked Cleverbot if it knew where Ben was. It said it did. I asked it where. It said behind you. I looked behind me and saw a mirror with my own moving body reflected in it. To this day, I'm ashamed of how loudly I screamed.
That's wild. I mean, getting caught up in something like that, especially with a game you like, can mess with your head. The way Cleverbot played into it just made it all feel more real. I can see how it would be creepy late at night. That moment with the mirror sounds intense. I'd probably have the same reaction. Sometimes, it's those little things that stick with you.
I've hated Slender Man's stuff ever since he became popular. All of the original fiction about him was about an inexplicable figure who would appear and gradually drive people crazy. There were mysteries and theories, and it was genuinely unique. Now, he's just some generic monster who kills people in the woods.
I get where you're coming from. It's like the initial concept had this eerie depth that made it intriguing. Now it feels like a lot of that has been lost in the oversaturation. It's just another horror figure without any of the unsettling mystery that made it special. Sometimes, the more something gets popular, the less unique it becomes. Makes you appreciate the original stories even more.
When I was a kid, I went to visit my grandma in Carlsbad. I was in a cornfield one night across from her house. She calls me in, saying that there are snakes in the field. I replied back, I like all animals. So what does she do? L.A. Llorona is gonna get you. Usain Bolt couldn't have outran me after that.
I remember a time when I was at my grandma's place, too. One night, she called me in because of some noise outside. I thought it was just the wind. She told me there were shadows moving. I shrugged it off. Then she said something scary, and I bolted inside. Sometimes you just don't want to take risks when it comes to those family stories. Better safe than sorry, right?
As a Mexican, I can confirm this. La Llorona has always been the scariest folklore in Mexico. They say she is the devil himself, disguised as a woman. I remember my mother told me the time her grandpa saw her. He was walking home after the bar when he saw what was a beautiful woman standing by herself in the middle of the street. He said that for some reason there was a glow to her that was subtle, and she was so captivating. He went up to her because she was crying. She was wearing a veil over her head. When he asked her what was wrong, she replied, Mis hijos, which means, my children. It sent utter chills down his spine, and she lifted her veil, her eyes turned red, and she began to screech. He turned around and started to run, and he could feel her right behind him, but at the same time it felt like he wasn't moving out of place. When he turned around, she was gone. Bone-chilling to hear this.
I've heard similar stories about La Llorona. It's crazy how folklore has a way of sticking around. I once had a friend who swore he saw her too, late at night by the river. He said it felt real, like time stopped for a moment. He always got uneasy whenever someone mentioned her. It's fascinating how these tales can haunt people, even if they're just stories. Makes you think about what's out there.
Lifelong chronic insomniac here. Longest stretch was 2 months with very few hours of sleep, like maybe 1 to 2 each week. I made the mistake of reading that story during that time. Never. Again. Edit. Thanks for all the love and all the questions. I did try drugs and natural herbs, melatonin. I'm completely drug-free at the moment. Not even taking meds for arthritis. The only thing that seems to work is regular exercise and a sleep schedule.
I've dealt with insomnia too. Was up for days, hardly catching any sleep. I remember trying everything, herbs, pills, even meditation. Nothing worked long-term. Eventually, I found that sticking to a routine helped me more than anything. Exercise played a big role as well. It's wild how something so simple can be the solution, right? Just goes to show how important it is to find what works for you.
I was horrified of the Chup as a kid. I saw some unsolved mysteries on the topic in the early 90s maybe, and even though I live in Canada, I was terrified because Robert Stack reported that the Chupacabra was steadily moving north. I hated walking home at night. I was totally sure that the Chup was hiding around every corner.
That's an interesting fear to have as a kid. Just imagining that creature lurking around would definitely make nighttime walks pretty stressful. I can see how watching those shows could really ramp up the anxiety. It's funny how those childhood fears can stick with you, even if you know it's unlikely. I guess we all have that one thing that creeps us out, even if it's just a legend.
I don't live in England, middle of the USA, and big cats are moving back this way from the mountains, but are still few and far in between, but we do have quite a bit of proof. About a month ago, I was driving home from work, and it was leading me through a rural area. I came around a corner and watched what I thought was a dog jump down off a ledge, cross the road, and into some underbrush. It wasn't until it was right at the edge of the road I saw that it was actually a mountain lion, and it was fucking massive. Makes me slightly uneasy letting my dogs into my backyard that opens up to a forest.
That's wild. I've seen a few big animals where I live too, but nothing like that. You really don't expect a mountain lion to just be chilling near the road. I can understand feeling uneasy with your dogs outside. Always better to be cautious, especially when there's something that big roaming around. Nature has its surprises, for sure.
There's an anime called Ghost Stories that depicts that myth. If you answer any color but those two, the hand will drag you straight to the underworld. As for the website, I remember it being a portal to the underworld, and some demon would chase you around until you got on a boat, like the River Styx. The demon would be disguised as a pretty girl to lure you there.
I actually had a friend who was super into urban legends. We used to talk about how some websites could lead you down strange paths. One day, he found this site claiming to reveal the secrets of the afterlife. He got really freaked out when he thought he saw a girl in the shadows of his screen. It turned into a joke among us, but he didn't go back to that site.
Man, of all the stories out there, Go Man got me the most. Something about the sheer mystery of it. The whole there's always been an extra person in here, but we never noticed it was mind-bending. But that wasn't the worst part. It was the description of the sounds. The way it talked was like a video of a cat talking on YouTube, but trying to speak English.
I get that. A friend once told me about a similar encounter in the woods. He felt like someone was watching him the whole time but saw nothing. Later, he heard strange sounds that reminded him of animals, yet not quite right. It stuck with him for days, wondering what was really out there. Odd how little things can mess with your head in that way.
Depending on the interpretation. Pretty sure most classic Wendigo stories involve an invisible possessive spirit that would turn people to savage cannibals, like the movie Ravenous or Pet Sematary. Then there's the Marvel version, which was basically a very not scary, slightly different version of the Hulk. Speaking of Pet Sematary, the book had one of the freakier Wendigo scenes I know of. The protagonist is half out of his mind, walking through the woods at night to the eponymous cemetery, sick, and the Wendigo lumbers across. He doesn't really see it, just hears it and sees the silhouette of something huge crossing the path in front of him.
I've never really considered the Wendigo until recently. A friend of mine was telling me about the Pet Sematary scene. He was really into horror stuff, and that one freaked him out. He described the tension of hearing something huge near him but not knowing what it was. It reminded me of a camping trip where we all heard strange noises in the woods. No idea what it was, but it definitely got our imaginations running.
Lots of native legends have grains of truth in them. For Wendigos, there's a big stigma behind cannibalism in native tribes. Now, scientifically, we know that a lot of bad shit can happen to you when you eat a human brain. So I think all it took was for Native Americans to see one guy go crazy from cannibalism for the Wendigo legends to start.
That's an interesting take on Wendigo legends. It seems like a mix of cautionary tales and real-life consequences. I mean, when someone sees someone lose it after doing something extreme like that, it's easy to see how stories would take shape. Those tales can stick around, serving as warnings not just about cannibalism, but about the darker sides of human nature. It reflects a lot about fears in society.
I vividly remember watching the part of that episode for the first time where the girl stepped over the salt line. The ghosts and demons and shit didn't scare me because they followed rules. They couldn't cross salt lines or only came out on full moons, but the second she crossed that line, I was legitimately scared. The formula wasn't working, whatever it was didn't follow the rules. It's funny that a human would seem the most supernatural of all the things they hunted.
I get that. It's always interesting when a character breaks the rules. Makes you rethink what's really out there. Like, you expect ghosts to stick to their boundaries, but then a human does something unexpected, and it shakes everything up. It kind of brings a new level of fear. Those moments stick with you, showing that sometimes the real danger isn't what you think it is. Just makes you feel uneasy.
A close friend of mine in high school showed up, sprinted inside, and was just absolutely terrified. Said he hit a dog about a mile up the road. Stopped and got out the car. Dog was laying still, presumably dead. Check on his car. Bumper looked all right. And he turned around to get back in the car. He saw the dog standing on its hind legs looking at him. He said it held at gaze for a moment, then just took off into the woods running on its hind legs. My friend was absolutely terrified, to the point that he had the entire house scared all night. No one wanted to go outside. Looking back, it was pretty dumb, but his fear was so real that it was contagious.
That sounds intense. I remember when my friend thought he hit a deer. He was freaking out, convinced it was dead. The whole time, we were just sitting in the car trying to calm him down. After a few minutes, he finally worked up the courage to check. Turned out it had just run off. The fear he had kind of spread to all of us. It was a tense night for sure.
I genuinely felt bad for those guys who worked on Marble Hornets. That series was legitimately unsettling, and while some parts were kind of lame, it was impossible for me to finish Lame I Know because of how weird it got. It never really blew itself out of proportion, as far as I got at least, like most horrors do, even professionally made ones. With all that well-thought-out effects and story, writing the whole concept got fucking ruined by the community when Slender Man was made into a meme by middle schoolers.
I remember watching Marble Hornets with a friend late at night. We both thought it was genuinely creepy, but we struggled to finish it. The tension was real, but the community's take on Slender Man definitely changed the vibe. It went from something eerie to just a bunch of memes. Kind of a bummer, really, because there was so much potential in what they created. Just didn't age well with all that.
Black-eyed children are mysterious creatures who supposedly resemble kids between the ages of about 6 and 16. Creatures who appear only in the night, when they show up at the doors of unsuspecting residents and ask, in breathless and monotone voices, to use the bathroom, make a phone call, get a ride home, or grab something to eat. Theories about black-eyed children variously claim them to be vampires, extraterrestrials, interdimensional beings, or some form of demon.
I remember a friend telling me about a time they were home alone at night. They heard a knock at the door and saw a kid outside with completely black eyes. The kid asked to come in and use the bathroom. My friend just froze, feeling uneasy. They didn't open the door, and the kid eventually left. It was odd and kind of creepy to think about, like something out of a horror story.
From /u/peachhoney8 further down. La Llorona is a Mexican folklore that has many different interpretations. The most common interpretation is La Llorona's husband had cheated on her with a younger, more beautiful woman. La Llorona wanted her husband to love her and give her attention again. So in order to get her husband's attention, La Llorona drowned her children and wept for them as she immediately regretted her decision. Then she killed herself. It is told that if you hear a woman crying and howling in pain, it is La Llorona longing for her children she killed. Where I live, adults use the story to scare children into going to bed early. The parents will usually tell them that if they're up late, they will hear her crying, and La Llorona will take them as her own children.
I remember hearing the La Llorona story from a friend during a sleepover. It was late, and we were all a bit spooked. They told us how her cries would haunt the streets, and I couldn't help but look over my shoulder all night. Later, when I heard my little cousin crying, I panicked for a second, thinking of the myth. It's funny how folklore can creep into your mind like that.
Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed. Love.